I am so glad you've decided to join me as we continue to try to understand what is the church exactly and what are we supposed to be doing. We're picking up our story having talked about the ferment and the conflict that was happening among Judahites under Roman domination. And as we mentioned, there was a tremendous creativity, a religious and theological fertility, we might say. In the midst of this creativity, in the midst of multiple movements, rabbis, teachers, and approaches to being faithful to Israel's God, there came Jesus from Nazareth. He didn't occupy any official religious position, but many of the leaders of movements in that time did not. We don't always see this clearly, but Pharisees in general were not officials and didn't have any official status or standing. And they were one movement in the midst of this ferment. So Jesus appears, and he is aware of other movements, other figures, other ways of interpreting the scriptures. And Jesus takes a position on all of the burning issues of that day. It's hard for us to see them that way because we're in a very different historical period and a historical context, and we don't know in general, unless you study, you are not privy to the arguments that were happening then. But Jesus takes an issue regarding Torah and the scriptures more generally. Jesus has a particular way of reading the scriptures, of interpreting the scriptures, which ought to be very important to us, but often is not. We go on and people use the scriptures without very much attention to the way that Jesus reads and interprets the scriptures. Jesus had a view, he has a position and an interpretation of the land of Israel. Jesus has a position on and an interpretation of the temple and its place. And Jesus has a particular understanding and interpretation of the people of God, the identity of the people of God. All of those things become important. They come to us through the New Testament. Much of the time we misunderstand them, but Jesus is actually taking very, very clear positions about them. When we look at how Jesus handles the scriptures, Jesus finds there particular threads which he lifts up and uses as a prism through which to see the whole of the text and through which to understand himself and his own ministry. Jesus lifts up texts that underline the deep goodness and love of God toward God's whole creation. Jesus lifts up threads, for example, if you remember the Ten Commandments. In one of the commandments, God says that there is judgment, curse, for 3 and 4 generations upon those who disobey. But for those who keep the commandment, God says there is blessing and grace to the 1,000th generation. We misunderstand that if we take it literally. That is a way to say poetically that God's blessing, God's gentle goodness, God's love far outweighs and swallows up God's judgment. God's judgment is to the 3rd and 4th generation. God's blessing and grace is to the 1,000th generation. There's no comparison between the two. And Jesus lifts up that thread that God is overwhelmingly good and gracious. And Jesus sees it everywhere in the Hebrew Scriptures, and it leads him into his own sayings, like when Jesus enjoins his followers to look around at the world and then understand that beneath it all is this profound goodness grace, mercy of God, and know that the very hairs of their head are numbered, because this good, humble God loves them and is looking out for them. Thanks for being with me this week. I'll see you again next week.